At 11:47 on the morning of September 12, 1944, a line of German prisoners marched through the gates of Camp White in southern Oregon. Among them was 22-year-old Sergeant Joseph Weber, who had spent the previous 16 months expecting the worst. The journey that brought him here had begun thousands of miles, away on the burning sands of North Africa. Captured near Tunis in the spring of 1943, Weber had watched Allied soldiers surround what remained of his unit. The war that had once promised glory and adventure now ended, with a simple order to surrender. Like many young Germans of his generation, Weber had grown up hearing stories about enemies who would show no mercy. During the long voyage across the Atlantic, packed aboard a Liberty ship with hundreds of other prisoners, he prepared himself for imprisonment, starvation, or worse. Instead, the Americans served regular meals, issued clean clothing, and treated their captives according to international law. Every unexpected kindness only deepened the prisoners' suspicion that something was being hidden from them. Weeks later, after crossing the United States by rail, Weber stepped down onto an Oregon platform and found himself staring at a landscape that felt strangely familiar. Dense pine forests covered the hillsides. Rivers wound through broad green valleys. Mountains rose in the distance beneath a clear autumn sky. For a moment, he was reminded of the forest near his childhood home in southern Germany. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While his mother endured rationing and nightly air raid warnings back in Stuttgart, Weber stood in a place untouched by war. The last letter he had received described shortages, damaged neighborhoods, and families waiting for sons who would never return from the Eastern Front. Ahead of him stretched Camp White, a vast military installation built to train American troops for combat overseas. More than 1,000 buildings covered the valley floor. Hidden within one corner of that enormous camp was a separate compound reserved for German prisoners of war. Joseph Weber had arrived expecting punishment. What he found instead would challenge everything he thought he knew about America. The first afternoon at Camp White passed in a haze of disbelief. An American sergeant carrying a clipboard led the newly arrived prisoners across the compound. No barking orders, no blows from rifle stocks, no threats. The men followed him between rows of wooden buildings while trying to understand what they were seeing. The prisoner barracks stood on level ground near the edge of the camp. Each building was simple but solid. Wooden walls, small windows, a tar paper roof built to withstand Oregon rain. Inside, every prisoner received a bunk, a mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow. Joseph Weber stopped beside his assigned bed and stared at it for several seconds. For nearly a year before his capture, comfort had been a forgotten luxury. In North Africa, he had slept on sand, gravel, truck floors, and once beneath a damaged artillery piece during a sandstorm. Now an American prison camp was offering him better accommodations than many German soldiers still fighting overseas. The prisoner assigned to the bunk above him was Corporal Karl Engel, a Bavarian farmer's son captured during the same campaign in Tunisia. Engel pressed a hand against the mattress and shook his head. "This feels like a hotel." Weber almost laughed. Neither man trusted what they were seeing. At 12:30, guards escorted the new arrivals to the mess hall. The building was crowded but orderly. Long wooden tables stretched across the room. Steam drifted from large cooking stations near the kitchen. The smell hit Weber immediately. Cooked meat, fresh bread, coffee. For a moment he simply stood in the doorway. The scent alone awakened memories of life before the war. The prisoners joined a serving line. American cooks filled metal trays with generous portions. Roast beef, potatoes covered in gravy, green vegetables, bread and butter, coffee. Weber carried his tray to a table and sat down. Around him, dozens of prisoners stared at their food. Nobody moved. The portion seemed impossible. During the final months in North Africa, supply shortages had become severe. Convoys from Europe rarely arrived intact. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Fuel, ammunition, and food disappeared faster than replacements could reach the front. Some weeks Weber survived on little more than hard bread and thin soup. Now he was looking at more food than he had eaten in a single day during certain periods of the campaign. Engel leaned closer. "You think they're trying to impress us?" Weber picked up his fork. "If they are, it's working." The first bite silenced him. The meat was tender. The potatoes were hot. Nothing about the meal felt temporary or staged. Gradually, the room filled with the sound of eating. Several prisoners lowered their heads to hide tears. Others consumed every scrap of food without speaking. When Weber finished, he sat quietly and watched the room. Nothing made sense. Everything he had been taught about enemy captivity suggested cruelty, deprivation, and humiliation. Instead, he found order, food, and basic dignity. Later that afternoon, a camp officer addressed the new prisoners in German. He explained the regulations. Prisoners would work 6 days each week. They would receive wages according to Geneva Convention guidelines. Money could be spent at the camp canteen. Mail service operated through the Red Cross. Books were available. Sports equipment could be borrowed. Educational classes were offered in the evenings. Medical treatment would be provided whenever necessary. The officer spoke calmly, as though discussing routine, administrative matters rather than enemy soldiers captured during a global war. When he finished, several prisoners exchanged confused looks. Finally, Weber raised his hand. The officer nodded. Yes? Weber hesitated. Then he asked the question occupying every mind in the room. Why are you treating us this way? The officer considered the question for a moment. Because you are prisoners of war. Nothing more. No speech. No lecture. Just a simple answer. The briefing ended shortly afterward. That evening, Weber sat outside the barracks watching. The Oregon sunset spread across distant mountains. The landscape looked strangely familiar. The forests, the valleys, the cool evening air. For brief moments it reminded him of southern Germany before the war consumed Europe. Engel joined him on the steps. For several minutes neither man spoke. Finally Engel broke the silence. When this war ends, nobody will believe these stories. Weber continued watching the fading sunlight. No. He nodded slowly. Nobody will. As darkness settled over Camp White, hundreds of German prisoners returned to their barracks. Some wrote letters. Some played cards. Some simply sat on their bunks thinking about home. Weber lay awake long after lights out. He thought about Stuttgart. He thought about his mother. He thought about friends who never left North Africa. Most of all, he thought about a question he could not answer. How had he traveled halfway around the world expecting hatred and punishment, only to arrive in a prison camp that seemed determined to prove everything he believed was wrong? That question followed him into sleep. The next morning, he would leave the camp for his first day working on an Oregon farm. And what he found there would challenge his assumptions even further. At 7:15 the next morning, a truck waited outside the compound. 36 prisoners climbed into the back while a single American guard checked names against a clipboard. Joseph Weber found a seat beside Carl Engel. The truck rolled through the gates of Camp White and headed south toward the farms surrounding Medford. For the first few miles, nobody spoke. The prisoners watched the countryside pass by. Green fields stretched toward distant hills. Barns stood beside neat rows of crops. Cattle grazed behind wooden fences. Farmhouses appeared along the roads, their windows intact, their roofs undamaged. Weber had not seen a landscape untouched by war in years. In Tunisia, destruction had become normal. Burned vehicles, abandoned positions, roads crowded with military traffic. Now he was looking at ordinary people living ordinary lives. The contrast felt unreal. After nearly 30 minutes, the truck turned onto a dirt road lined with pear trees. A farmer waited beside a pickup truck near the entrance. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with weathered hands and a sunburned face. When the prisoners climbed down from the truck, he greeted them in German. The unexpected sound immediately caught everyone's attention. "My name is Raymond Fisher," he said. "My parents came from Germany. Today you're helping with the harvest." Several prisoners exchanged surprised looks. The farmer explained the work. Pick the fruit carefully. Avoid bruising it. Fill the wooden crates. Stack the crates near the road. A productive worker could complete more than 30 boxes before the end of the day. The instructions were simple. Then Fisher demonstrated the process himself. He picked several pears and placed them into a crate. When he finished, he pointed toward the orchard. "Any questions?" Nobody spoke. "Good," he said. "Let's get started." Weber expected guards to spread through the orchard. Instead, only one remained. The guard unfolded a chair beneath a tree, opened a newspaper, and began reading. Engel stared at him. "That's it?" Weber looked around. Apparently it was. The prisoners dispersed among the rows of trees and began working. The Oregon morning was cool and pleasant. Sunlight filtered through the leaves overhead. Birds moved between branches. For long stretches, the only sounds came from ladders, shifting against trees and fruit dropping gently into wooden crates. By mid-morning, Weber had filled several boxes. The work was steady but uncomplicated. More importantly, nobody was shouting. Weber unwrapped his sandwich and stared at it for a moment. Ham and cheese. Simple food. But it was more than many civilians in Germany were receiving by late 1944. Fischer sat nearby while the prisoners ate. He asked where they came from. Munich, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Stuttgart. One by one the men answered. The conversation felt almost normal. At one point, Weber finally asked the question that had been bothering him all morning. Why only one guard? Fischer smiled. Where would you go? Several prisoners laughed quietly. The farmer continued. You don't know the roads. You don't have transportation. You don't have civilian clothes. And every sheriff in Southern Oregon knows German prisoners work these farms. He shrugged. Escape doesn't make much sense. Nobody argued. The logic was difficult to deny. After lunch, the work resumed. The afternoon passed quickly. By 3 o'clock, Weber had already exceeded the daily quota. When Fischer inspected the stacked crates, he nodded with approval. You work carefully. Weber thanked him. The compliment felt strangely meaningful. For years, military service had reduced men to numbers. Now someone was judging him by the quality of his work, rather than the uniform he once wore. As the day ended, the truck returned. The prisoners climbed aboard and headed back toward Camp White. The setting sun cast long shadows across the valley. Weber sat quietly watching the countryside. The orchards, the farms, the distant mountains. Everything seemed peaceful. Back at camp, the evening meal awaited them. Again, there was plenty of food. Again, the portions exceeded expectations. After dinner, Weber visited the camp canteen for the first time. Using money issued through the prisoner pay system, he purchased writing paper and envelopes. That night, he sat at a table in the barracks and began a letter to his mother. He wrote carefully. The Americans were treating him well. He was healthy. He was working outdoors. He had enough food. Several times he stopped writing. Certain details seemed impossible to explain. How could he describe the orchards? The farmer who spoke German? The sandwiches under the trees? The guard reading a newspaper while enemy prisoners worked unsupervised? Back home, people would assume he was exaggerating, perhaps even lying. Eventually, he finished the letter and folded it into an envelope. Whether it reached Germany was another question. Mail traveled slowly across a continent and an ocean before crossing a war zone. Still, writing the letter made him feel connected to home. Before lights out, Engel approached his bunk. What are you thinking about? My mother too. Engel nodded. Me too. For a few moments, both men sat in silence. Then Engel looked around the barracks. The mattresses, the blankets, the electric lights, the shelves filled with books. Do you ever wonder, he asked quietly, if Germany knows any of this? Weber considered the question. No, but or why not? Because if people knew, they might start asking other questions. Engel did not reply. Neither man needed to explain what those questions might be. Outside, the camp settled into silence. Inside the barracks, hundreds of German prisoners prepared for another day. And with every passing week, more of them would discover that life inside Camp White was becoming something none of them had expected. Not merely survival, but a glimpse of a different world. The routine settled into place faster than Joseph Weber expected. Each weekday began before sunrise. Breakfast in the mess hall. A truck ride through the Rogue Valley, then a full day of labor in orchards, fields, and farms scattered across southern Oregon. The work changed depending on the season. Some weeks the prisoners harvested pears. Other weeks they picked apples, sorted onions, loaded potatoes, or repaired fencing damaged by winter storms. The labor was physical but predictable. For many prisoners, predictability itself felt like a luxury. In North Africa, every day had brought uncertainty. Artillery fire, supply shortages, rumors of Allied attacks, orders that changed by the hour. At Camp White, tomorrow usually looked like today, and that stability slowly changed the men. By October, Weber had become one of Fischer's preferred workers. The farmer appreciated careful labor. Weber appreciated being treated like a human being. The arrangement benefited both men. One afternoon, while loading crates onto a truck, Fischer asked a question. What did you do before the war? Weber adjusted a wooden box onto the stack. My father owned a print shop. Fisher nodded. Good trade. It was. You miss it? Weber looked across the orchard. Every day. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Fisher said something Weber would remember for years. Wars end. Skills remain. The sentence stayed with him long after the workday ended. That evening, Weber attended one of the camp's English classes. The classroom occupied a converted recreation building near the library. Rows of desks faced a chalkboard. An American lieutenant taught the course. Unlike many military instructors, he possessed endless patience. He spoke slowly, repeated difficult phrases, corrected mistakes without embarrassment. The first lessons focused on practical conversation, simple greetings, directions, basic vocabulary, useful expressions. Most prisoners enrolled because the classes offered a break from routine. Yet many continued attending because they enjoyed learning. For years, propaganda had portrayed Americans as shallow and uncultured. The classes suggested otherwise. The lieutenant respected intelligence. He encouraged questions. He treated the prisoners like students rather than captives. Within weeks, Weber could read simple English sentences. Within months, he could hold short conversations. The progress surprised him. One evening after class, the lieutenant handed him a newspaper. Try reading this. The newspaper was several days old, an edition of the Oregonian. Weber sat in the library and slowly worked through the articles. Some sections were difficult. The disagreement caught Weber's attention. Back home, newspapers rarely disagreed with official positions. Here they seemed to argue openly. The realization was unsettling and fascinating. By November, educational programs expanded beyond language instruction. Prisoners could attend lectures on American history, government, and economics. Participation was voluntary. Nobody forced attendance. That fact alone impressed Weber. In Germany, education usually arrived with expectations. Here, attendance depended entirely on personal choice. One lecture focused on elections. The instructor explained how citizens voted for local, state, and national leaders. Several prisoners immediately assumed the presentation was propaganda. One man stood and challenged the speaker. You expect us to believe people can openly disagree with the government? The instructor smiled. Of course. The prisoner crossed his arms. And they are not arrested? No. The room erupted in skeptical laughter. The instructor waited patiently. Then he distributed newspapers from different political viewpoints. The articles criticized each other. Some supported government policies. Others opposed them. All had been legally published. The prisoners examined the papers carefully. Many remained unconvinced. But doubts had begun to appear. For Weber, the questions were becoming difficult to ignore. If everything he had been taught about America was true, why did reality look so different? The contradictions accumulated week after week. The respectful treatment, the wages, the classes, the libraries, the farmers who invited prisoners into their homes for meals and coffee. Each experience chipped away at assumptions formed over years. Near the end of November, Fisher approached Weber with a special request. A new garage needed construction. Concrete work, foundation preparation, framing. The project would require several weeks. Interested? Weber accepted immediately. The work offered a welcome change from harvesting fruit. A small group of prisoners joined the project. Every morning they traveled to Fisher's property and spent the day building. The farmer worked alongside them, not supervising from a distance. Working, mixing concrete, measuring boards, carrying materials. The example impressed the prisoners. One cold afternoon, rain interrupted construction. Fisher waved everyone toward the farmhouse. Inside, his wife had prepared coffee and fresh bread. The prisoners sat around a large kitchen table. Steam rose from coffee cups. Rain tapped softly against the windows. For a moment, the scene felt impossibly normal, like neighbors gathering during bad weather rather than enemy soldiers in wartime. Mrs. Fisher asked questions about Germany, about families, about hometowns, about life before military service. When Weber mentioned the print shop, she listened carefully. My father was a printer, she said. The connection surprised him. For nearly an hour, the conversation continued. No politics, no arguments, just ordinary people discussing ordinary lives. When the rain stopped, nobody seemed eager to leave. But work remained unfinished. The prisoners returned to the construction site. As they walked outside, Engel moved beside Weber. "This keeps happening." "What does?" Engel gestured toward the farmhouse. "The more Americans I meet, the less I understand the war." Weber looked back at the house. Warm lights glowed through the windows. He understood exactly what Engel meant. The enemy described in speeches and newspapers seemed increasingly difficult to find. Instead, they found farmers, teachers, workers, families, people who laughed, argued, worried, and hoped for the future exactly as Germans did. That realization was changing everything, and for many prisoners at Camp White, the biggest transformation had only begun. By the beginning of 1945, Camp White felt less like a temporary stop and more like a world of its own. Winter settled over southern Oregon. Cold rain swept across the valley. Snow appeared on the distant mountain peaks. The orchards stood bare, their branches stripped of fruit. Work continued despite the weather. Farmers still needed labor. Fences required repair. Storage buildings needed maintenance. Equipment had to be cleaned and prepared for spring. For the prisoners, routine remained the anchor that held everything together. Then new arrivals began reaching the camp. These prisoners were different. Most had been captured during the fighting in France and Belgium. Many came from units shattered during the Battle of the Bulge. Unlike the Africa veterans, they had spent less time in captivity. The war still felt immediate to them. Their anger remained fresh. When they entered the mess hall for the first time, they reacted much like Weber had months earlier. Confusion, suspicion, disbelief. One young prisoner stared at his dinner tray and refused to sit down. Another accused the Americans of staging the entire meal. Several insisted the good treatment must be part of some larger deception. The older prisoners watched quietly. They remembered feeling exactly the same way. A week later, most of the newcomers were eating every meal without complaint. A month later, many attended English classes. Reality had a way of overcoming expectations. One evening, Weber sat in the library reading a newspaper article about the fighting in Europe. The Allies were advancing from the west. The Soviet army was advancing from the east. German cities appeared regularly in casualty reports. Entire neighborhoods were being destroyed. Factories were disappearing beneath waves of bombing. The article mentioned Stuttgart. Weber stopped reading. For several moments he stared at the page. His hometown existed somewhere beneath those headlines. His mother still lived there. At least he hoped she did. Months had passed since receiving a letter. Mail delays were common, but uncertainty never became easier. That night he wrote another letter. The words came slowly. What could he say? That he was safe? That he had enough food? That he spent his days working on Oregon farms while Europe burned? Every sentence felt inadequate. Still, he wrote, and hoped. In February, the garage project on Fisher's farm was completed. The concrete had cured properly. The walls stood straight. The roof was secure. Fisher walked through the structure with obvious satisfaction. "You did good work," he told Weber. The praise mattered more than expected. For years, military life had measured success through ranks and orders. Here, success was measured by craftsmanship, by whether something had been built well. When the inspection ended, Fisher handed Weber an envelope. Weber looked at it. "What is this?" "Bonus." "For what?" "For helping finish the job." Weber tried to refuse. Fisher shook his head. "You earned it." Inside were several dollars. Not a fortune, but enough to purchase items from the camp canteen for weeks. That evening, Weber bought magazines, writing supplies, and several chocolate bars. The chocolate reminded him of childhood, a small luxury from a world that seemed increasingly distant. Later, while reading one of the magazines, he noticed photographs of American factories. Rows of machines stretched across enormous buildings. Workers assembled automobiles at remarkable speed. Thousands of vehicles rolled from production lines every month. The scale was difficult to comprehend. During the North African campaign, shortages had become constant companions. Fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, vehicle shortages. Everything seemed scarce. Yet these photographs suggested an industrial capacity unlike anything Germany could match. For the first time, Weber began to understand the larger picture. Battles mattered. Leadership mattered. Strategy mattered. But production mattered too. A nation capable of building endless trucks, tanks, ships, and aircraft possessed advantages that courage alone could not overcome. The realization was uncomfortable, but impossible to ignore. As winter turned toward spring, educational programs at Camp White expanded again. Several instructors introduced courses discussing democratic institutions and constitutional government. The Americans never described the classes as re-education. They simply offered information. Attend if interested, ignore them if not. Many prisoners attended out of curiosity. Others attended because the classrooms were warm. Whatever their reasons, the discussions often continued long after class ended. One evening, an instructor invited local citizens to speak. The guests included farmers, business owners, and a school teacher. They discussed politics openly. Some supported President Roosevelt. Others disagreed with him. The disagreements were respectful but direct. The German prisoners listened carefully. The scene felt extraordinary. Back home, public criticism of national leadership carried obvious risks. Here citizens voiced opposing opinions without fear. Afterward, Engels sat beside Weber outside the barracks. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Engels broke the silence. If someone talked like that in Germany, he left the sentence unfinished. Weber nodded. No explanation was necessary. The contrast was obvious. As the months passed, these experiences accumulated. Individually, each seemed small. A conversation, a class, a newspaper article, a meal shared around a kitchen table. Together they formed something larger, a different understanding of the country holding them prisoner. By April, rumors filled the camp. Germany's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Cities were falling. Supply networks were collapsing. The front lines moved closer to Berlin every day. Nobody knew exactly when the war would end, but everyone sensed the conclusion approaching. The uncertainty affected the prisoners in different ways. Some looked forward to returning home. Others feared what they would find there. Weber belonged to the second group. Every newspaper article increased his concern. Every week without a letter deepened it. One evening he stood outside the barracks watching rain move across the valley. The mountains disappeared behind dark clouds. For the first time since arriving in Oregon, he found himself dreading the future. Not because he feared captivity, but because captivity might end. And when it did, he would finally discover what remained of the life he left behind. On the morning of May 8, 1945, Camp White woke to a different atmosphere. The news had already begun spreading before breakfast. Guards whispered to one another. Officers moved between buildings carrying papers. Prisoners exchanged rumors in the barracks. Something significant had happened. Shortly after noon, loudspeakers across the camp ordered all German prisoners to assemble in the main yard. Hundreds of men gathered in orderly rows. Some stood with arms folded. Others stared silently toward the administration building. Joseph Weber found a place beside Karl Engel. Nobody spoke. An American officer stepped forward holding a document. He read a short statement in English. Most prisoners understood only fragments. Then a translator repeated the announcement in German. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The armed forces of the Third Reich had laid down their weapons. Berlin had fallen. Adolf Hitler was dead. The conflict that had consumed an entire continent was finished. Silence followed. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of finality. For years, every decision, every sacrifice, every fear had revolved around the war. Now in a matter of minutes it belonged to history. Weber looked around. Some prisoners stared at the ground. Others gazed toward the mountains beyond the camp fences. A few closed their eyes. No cheering. No shouting. No dramatic reactions. Just quiet acceptance. Eventually the assembly ended. The prisoners returned to their barracks. Life continued. Yet everything had changed. That evening Engels sat on his bunk staring at the floor. For nearly an hour he said nothing. Then he spoke. "My brother died in Russia." Weber looked up. Engels continued. "My father died in Poland." Silence returned. Finally he asked a question. What was it all for? Weber had no answer. Neither did anyone else. Across Europe, millions of families were asking the same question. The following weeks felt strangely uncertain. The war had ended. Yet the prisoners remained in Oregon. American authorities had not completed the repatriation process. Transportation schedules were complicated. Occupation zones required organization. Ships needed assignment. Until those arrangements were finished, the prisoners would continue working. Most accepted the situation without complaint. The farm still required labor. Harvest season approached again. Life moved forward. But conversations changed. Instead of discussing the war, prisoners discussed the future. Would their homes still exist? Were their families alive? What kind of Germany awaited them? Nobody knew. One afternoon, Weber worked alongside Fischer repairing irrigation equipment. The farmer sensed his mood. "You've been quiet lately." Weber tightened a bolt and shrugged. "I keep thinking about home." Fischer nodded. "Natural. I don't even know if I have a home anymore." For a moment, the farmer studied him. Then he spoke carefully. "You'll find out soon enough." "And if everything is gone?" Fischer looked across the orchard. "Then you build again." The answer sounded simple. Perhaps too simple. Yet Weber understood what he meant. Throughout Oregon, he had seen people building, planting, repairing, expanding, always preparing for the future. Maybe rebuilding worked the same way, one step at a time. As summer arrived, work increased. The orchards required constant attention. The prisoners harvested fruit, repaired fences, loaded trucks, and maintained equipment. Many farmers specifically requested workers they knew and trusted. Weber spent most days on Fischer's property. The relationship between employer and prisoner had gradually transformed into something resembling friendship. Neither man ignored the reality of the war, but they also recognized the humanity standing in front of them. One afternoon, Fischer invited several prisoners to his house for a meal after work. His wife prepared roast chicken, vegetables, fresh bread, and pie. The invitation surprised the newcomers. Older prisoners simply smiled. They had experienced similar gestures before. During dinner, conversation drifted toward family histories. Stories about childhood, stories about work, stories about life before the war interrupted everything. At one point, Fischer's wife looked directly at Weber. "What will you do when you get back?" The question lingered in the room. "I don't know." It was the truth. Germany existed in his mind as memories and newspaper headlines. The reality waiting across the Atlantic remained unknown. When the meal ended, Fischer walked him outside. The evening sun cast long shadows across the orchard. Rows of pear trees stretched toward the horizon. "You know," Fischer said, "there will always be work here." Weber looked at him. The farmer continued. "Maybe not now. Maybe not next year. But someday." Neither man elaborated. The meaning was obvious. Fischer had already made similar offers to several prisoners, not because he needed workers, because he respected them, because he believed people deserved second chances. As autumn approached, transportation orders finally began arriving. Groups of prisoners left Camp White every few weeks. Some traveled east by train. Others departed through ports along the Pacific coast. Every departure reminded those remaining that their own turn was approaching. The camp population steadily declined. Barracks that once held dozens of men gradually emptied. Familiar faces disappeared. Farewells became routine. By November, Weber knew his departure could come at any moment. The realization produced conflicting emotions. Part of him longed to see Germany again, to find his family, to understand what remained of his former life. Another part dreaded leaving Oregon. The mountains, the orchards, the friendships, the strange sense of peace he had discovered in a place he never expected to find it. One evening he stood outside watching the sunset beyond the valley. Engel joined him. "Thinking about leaving?" "Yes." Engel nodded. "So am I." For several moments they watched the fading light. Then Engel laughed quietly. "If someone had told me 2 years ago that I would be sad to leave an American prison camp, I would have called him insane." Weber smiled. "So would I." Yet both knew it was true. The barbed wire still surrounded Camp White. The guards still carried rifles. The prisoners were still captives. But somewhere along the way, Oregon had become more than a prison. It had become a place neither man would ever forget. In December of 1945, Joseph Weber finally received his departure orders. A typed notice instructed him to report to the administration office with all personal belongings. After more than a year in Oregon, his time at Camp White was ending. The announcement produced emotions he had not expected. Relief, anxiety, curiosity, and something surprisingly close to sadness. The following days passed quickly. Prisoners scheduled for transport packed their possessions, and completed final paperwork. Most owned very little, a few magazines, letters from home, writing supplies purchased from the canteen, small souvenirs accumulated during captivity. Weber's collection fit easily into a single bag. Yet each item carried memories. The magazines reminded him of evenings spent learning English. The letters reminded him of the uncertainty that had followed every report from Europe. Even the worn envelopes represented a connection to a world that had nearly disappeared. A few days before departure, he finally received long-delayed correspondence from Germany. Several letters had arrived together. All were months old. Some had been written before the surrender, others shortly afterward. He read them repeatedly. The news was painful. Large sections of Stuttgart had been destroyed. Entire streets no longer existed. The family print shop had been lost. Relatives were scattered across different regions. Food remained scarce. Housing remained scarce. Everything remained uncertain. Yet one fact mattered above all others. His mother was alive. For the first time in months, Weber felt genuine relief. On the afternoon before departure, Raymond Fisher arrived at Camp White requesting permission to visit. The guards approved the meeting. The two men sat across from each other in a visitor area separated by wire fencing. For a moment, neither spoke. There was too much to say. Finally, Fisher broke the silence. "So, you're heading home?" "Yes." The farmer nodded slowly. "You'll be missed." Weber smiled. "I never thought I would hear that from an American." Fisher laughed. "I never thought I'd say it to a former enemy soldier." The conversation continued for nearly an hour. They discussed the orchard, the garage project, the harvest seasons, the future. Before leaving, Fisher removed an envelope from his jacket. He pushed it through the opening in the wire. Weber immediately shook his head. "No, take it." "I can't." "You can." Reluctantly, Weber accepted the envelope. Inside was money. More than he expected. Enough to help a family survive difficult months. Fisher leaned forward. "When you get home, take care of your mother." Weber lowered his eyes. "I will. And if things become difficult..." The farmer paused. "Remember what I told you?" Weber knew exactly what he meant. The offer remained open. A job. A future. A possible return to Oregon. Neither man mentioned it directly. They didn't need to. When the visit ended, Fisher stood and extended his hand. The gesture felt natural. Two working men saying goodbye. Weber shook it firmly. Then the farmer walked away. The next morning, trucks waited outside the compound. Former prisoners loaded their bags and climbed aboard. The barracks disappeared behind them as the convoy moved toward the highway. Weber watched Camp White grow smaller in the distance. The guard towers, the administration buildings, the recreation yard, the rows of barracks. For many Americans, it was merely a military installation. For Weber, it represented one of the most unexpected chapters of his life. Beside him, Engel stared through the side of the truck. Neither man spoke for several miles. Eventually, Engel broke the silence. "Do you think you'll ever come back?" Weber considered the question. "I don't know." The answer was honest. Germany needed rebuilding. Families needed rebuilding. Lives needed rebuilding. The future remained impossible to predict. Yet Oregon had planted a seed in his mind. A possibility, nothing more. The convoy continued northward. Mountains rolled past the windows. Rivers cut through valleys below. The familiar landscape remained as beautiful as the day he first arrived. Months earlier, he had stepped off a train expecting hatred. Instead, he had found something entirely different. Not perfection, not paradise, but kindness where he expected cruelty, opportunity where he expected punishment, understanding where he expected resentment. Those memories traveled with him all the way to the coast. The voyage back across the Atlantic felt shorter than the journey to America. Perhaps because uncertainty no longer dominated every thought. The war was over. The destination was known. Germany awaited. When Weber finally returned to Stuttgart in early 1946, reality proved even harsher than newspaper reports suggested. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Buildings stood roofless. Factories stood silent. Families crowded into damaged apartments and temporary shelters. Everywhere he looked, reconstruction had barely begun. The city seemed exhausted. People moved through daily life with quiet determination. Survival came first. Everything else could wait. Finding his mother was easier than expected. Neighbors directed him toward a partially damaged building where she occupied several rooms. The reunion left both speechless. For a long time, neither could do anything except embrace. The years vanished. The war vanished. Only family remained. Later, when practical concerns returned, Weber gave her the money Fisher had provided. She stared at it in disbelief. Resources were desperately needed. Food could be purchased. Supplies could be purchased. The gift represented more than generosity. It represented stability during a time when stability barely existed. Over the following months, Weber found employment in the printing trade. His pre-war experience proved valuable. Businesses desperately needed skilled workers. Printing presses required operators. Documents required production. The rebuilding of Germany required communication. Work was difficult. Resources remained limited. Yet progress slowly appeared. As reconstruction continued, Weber noticed something unexpected. Many political and civic discussions sounded familiar. Local officials spoke about representative government, elections, constitutional protections, public participation. The concepts reminded him of classes attended at Camp White. At the time, he had listened with curiosity. Now he listened with understanding. Years later, he would often remember those evenings in Oregon. The English lessons, the newspapers, the debates, the conversations around kitchen tables, not because they had changed his nationality, but because they had changed his perspective. The lessons followed him long after he stopped being a prisoner. And although he could not know it then, they would continue shaping decisions he had yet to make. Joseph Weber spent the rest of his life in the Rogue Valley. The years passed quickly. The orchards grew. The small farm he eventually purchased expanded beyond anything he had imagined while sitting behind barbed wire at Camp White. His children grew up speaking English. His grandchildren grew up knowing America as the only home they had ever known. Yet Weber never forgot how it all began. Not with opportunity, not with freedom, not even with immigration. It began with surrender. A young German sergeant captured in North Africa. A prisoner loaded onto a ship and sent across an ocean. A man convinced that captivity meant humiliation, starvation, and punishment. Instead, he found something entirely different. Late in life, one of his grandsons asked him a simple question. "What made you come back to Oregon?" The answer took much longer than the question. Weber spoke about the war, about the endless heat of Tunisia and the exhaustion of defeat, about boarding a ship expecting cruelty and discovering kindness, about arriving in southern Oregon and seeing mountains that reminded him of home. He spoke about the first meal at Camp White, the first night in a clean bed, the first day working in an orchard where a farmer trusted prisoners, enough to leave them with almost no supervision. He remembered the English classes, the newspapers, the conversations that continued long after work ended, the lessons that challenged beliefs he had carried since childhood. Most of all, he remembered the people. The farmer who judged him by his work rather than his uniform. The teacher who treated enemy soldiers like students. The families who welcomed prisoners into their kitchens and spoke to them as equals. Those experiences stayed with him long after the war ended. Weber often said that the most important thing he learned in Oregon was not English. It was trust. For the first time, he saw a society confident enough to show mercy to defeated enemies, a country powerful enough to choose restraint, a place where ordinary citizens could disagree with leaders, build businesses, own property, and shape their own futures. Years later, when people asked why he chose America over Germany, his answer remained remarkably simple. Because Oregon gave him a second life. Germany gave him his childhood. Germany gave him his family. But Oregon gave him a future. The orchards he planted continued producing fruit long after he was gone. The friendships he built lasted decades, and the lessons he learned as a prisoner followed him for the rest of his life. A young man arrived at Camp White believing everything he had been told. An older man left understanding that freedom is often recognized most clearly by someone who once lived without it, and that understanding changed the course of his life forever.